The sirens were already wailing when I threw the envelope on his kitchen table. My hands shook so hard the paper rattled against the wood. My son stood there, arms crossed, that smirk plastered on his face like he'd just won something. The DNA results he'd demanded for months were finally in his hands, and I couldn't breathe. I physically could not draw air into my lungs. The room tilted sideways and I grabbed the counter, my knuckles white, thinking, this is it. This is how I die, right here in front of the person I sacrificed everything for. The granite was cold under my palm. I remember that detail with perfect clarity, cold and smooth and expensive, just like everything else in this house that was supposed to represent success. Their kitchen smelled of some vanilla candle that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Through the window behind Michael's head, I could see their perfectly manicured lawn, the kind that requires professional care and weekly treatments. Everything here screamed achievement, prosperity, the American dream realized. And I was the embarrassment that didn't fit the picture, but I didn't die. I turned around and walked out, leaving him there with his precious proof, his validation that yes, I was indeed his mother, the failure he'd spent years trying to distance himself from. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else as I crossed that kitchen, past the wine rack filled with bottles I couldn't pronounce, past the family photos on the wall where I appeared less and less frequently, past Rachel who pressed herself against the wall, as if my shame might be contagious. Let me take you back 3 months earlier, before everything exploded, before the accusations and the conspiracy, and the moment I realized my own blood had turned against me, back when I still believed family meant something sacred. I lived in Phoenix, in a modest house with a porch I'd painted myself, twice actually, because the first time I picked the wrong shade of blue. The first attempt had been too bright, almost turquoise, and it clashed with the desert landscape in a way that made me wince every time I pulled into the driveway. The second time I chose a softer blue, like faded denim, and it felt right. That porch became my sanctuary, where I'd sit in the early mornings with my coffee, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that no artist could quite capture. The neighborhood was quiet, tree-lined streets where people still waved at each other, where Mrs. Chen, from 2 doors down, brought me homemade dumplings every other Tuesday. I was 60 years old, and I thought I knew who I was. Retired school teacher, mother of 1, grandmother to 2 beautiful babies I wasn't allowed to see anymore. That should have been my first clue something was rotting beneath the surface. The last time I'd seen my grandchildren was at Michael's birthday dinner, almost 8 months before everything fell apart. Little Emma was 3 then, with curls that bounced when she ran, and she'd climbed into my lap without hesitation, sticky hands grabbing at my necklace. Jake was just 6 months old, all chubby cheeks and drool, and Rachel had handed him to me with that tight smile she'd perfected, the one that never reached her eyes. I'd held him for maybe 10 minutes before she took him back, claiming he needed to be changed. Looking back, I wonder if that was the last time I'd ever hold my grandchildren. The thought still wakes me up at night, that casual moment that turned out to be a final goodbye. My son Michael had always been ambitious. Sharp suits, expensive car, the kind of man who measured success in square footage and salary brackets. I was proud of him, or I convinced myself I was. Even when he started making comments about my little house, my thrift store furniture, my beat-up Honda Civic that refused to die. "You're living like this, Mom?" he'd say, his voice dripping with something between pity and disgust. I have colleagues who might drive through this neighborhood. I'd laugh it off, tell him not everyone needed granite countertops to be happy. But it hadn't always been this way. When Michael was young, when his father was still alive, he'd been different, softer somehow. I remember him at 12, bringing me dandelions he'd picked from the yard, presenting them like they were roses. I remember him at 16, defensive and furious when a classmate made a joke about my old car, ready to fight despite being skinny and uncoordinated. When did that boy disappear? When did he turn into this man who looked at me like I was something he'd stepped in? The shift had been gradual, I realized later. It started when he got into that prestigious MBA program, when he began networking with people whose parents were doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs. He'd come home for holidays, and I'd hear him on the phone with his new friends, his voice changing, his accent smoothing out, erasing the traces of our working-class neighborhood. He started using words like optics and brand management and professional trajectory. I didn't understand then that he was talking about reinventing himself, and that reinvention required erasing where he came from. But the comments got sharper, more frequent. He started bringing his wife Rachel to fewer and fewer family dinners, and when she did come, she'd wipe down the chairs before sitting, her nose wrinkled like my home smelled of failure. Maybe it did. Maybe I'd stopped noticing. Rachel had never liked me, not really. I knew this from the beginning, from the first time Michael brought her home to meet me. She'd arrived in designer jeans and heels too high for my gravel driveway, picking her way to my front door like she was navigating a minefield. She'd accepted my hug with the enthusiasm of someone embracing a cactus and spent the entire dinner pushing food around her plate, asking pointed questions about my career plans and whether I'd ever considered upgrading my living situation. Michael had been too infatuated to notice, or maybe he'd noticed and hadn't cared. I remember their wedding, how Rachel's mother had made a speech thanking God that her daughter had found such a wonderful man who'd overcome his humble beginnings. The implication was clear. Michael had succeeded despite me, not because of me. I'd smiled through it, clapped along with everyone else, and later that night I'd cried in my hotel room, feeling like an intruder at my own son's wedding. The first real crack appeared on a Sunday in late January. Michael showed up unannounced, which was unusual. He never just dropped by anymore, not without scheduling it like a business meeting. I was in my garden, working on the raised beds where I grew tomatoes and herbs, my hands deep in the soil, when I heard his car pull up. For a moment I felt hope bloom in my chest. Maybe he was here to apologize for missing Christmas. Maybe he wanted to talk, to reconnect, to remember who we used to be to each other. But when I came around the side of the house, brushing dirt from my hands, I saw his face and knew immediately this wasn't a social call. He stood in my living room, wouldn't even sit down, and he said, "Mom, we need to talk about your past." My past? I'd been teaching elementary school for 35 years. I'd never even gotten a speeding ticket. What past was there to discuss? I can still see the way the afternoon sunlight slanted through my living room window, illuminating dust motes that danced between us. I can still smell the scent of the lemon cookies I'd baked that morning, thinking maybe I'd take some to Mrs. Chen. I remember all these tiny details with perfect clarity, the way you remember everything about the moment your life changes forever. He pulled out his phone, started scrolling through something. "Do you know what people are saying about you? About our family?" I didn't. I genuinely had no idea. Apparently some old rumor had resurfaced, something about me having an affair decades ago, about Michael not being my husband's biological child. Ancient gossip, I thought, had died with my husband 7 years earlier. But Michael, my successful image-conscious son, had heard these whispers through some distant cousin at a corporate event. And suddenly my entire history was under investigation. "Who's saying this?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "Michael, honey, that rumor was always nonsense. Your father and I, we had our problems like any couple, but I never—" "Dad's business partner," Michael interrupted, his fingers still scrolling. "Remember Jim? He was at Rachel's company mixer last month. He made a comment about how I looked nothing like Dad. Then someone else, I don't even remember who, mentioned they'd heard rumors back in the day. And then Rachel's mother said she'd heard the same thing from Aunt Patricia. Aunt Patricia, my own sister. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but I tried to keep my face neutral. Patricia said what exactly? That you and Dad had problems. That you'd been seen with another man. That Dad had suspicions, but never pursued them because he loved me too much to make it an issue. Michael's voice was flat, reciting facts from a report. "Is any of this true?" I tried to laugh. "Michael, honey, you look exactly like your father. You have his eyes, his stubborn chin, that weird double-jointed thumb thing." "Genetics can skip generations," he said, and I realized he'd been researching this, preparing his case. "I need to know for certain." He wasn't laughing. He wanted proof, scientific proof, DNA results. I felt something crack inside my chest that day. Not break, just crack, like ice over a frozen pond. A warning sound before everything collapses. But I told myself he was just stressed, that work was getting to him, that he'd come to his senses. I made him tea he didn't drink and tried to hug him as he left. He stood rigid in my arms, like embracing a mannequin. "Just think about it, Mom," he said at the door, not meeting my eyes. "This is important to me, to my family. We need certainty. His family, not our family. His family." The distinction wasn't lost on me. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, watching the blades cut circles through the darkness, and I thought about all the years I'd spent being Michael's mother. The sleepless nights when he had colic, walking him in circles around this very house at 3 a.m, singing off-key lullabies until my voice gave out. The science fair projects, the soccer practices, the college application essays I'd helped him revise 17 times, the money I'd borrowed against my pension to help with his wedding, that beautiful outdoor ceremony in Sedona that cost more than my car. I thought about the time he had pneumonia at age 7, how I'd slept in a chair next to his bed for 5 nights straight, monitoring his breathing, terrified I'd lose him. I thought about teaching him to drive, his nervous hands on the wheel, my heart in my throat every time he merged onto the highway. I thought about his high school graduation, how he'd found me in the crowd and waved, his smile so bright it could have powered the sun. When had I become someone he needed proof to believe in? I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I should have told him no, should have demanded respect, should have drawn a line right there. But love isn't that simple. Love makes you weak and desperate and willing to accept crumbs when you used to have the whole feast. Love paralyzes you in the face of rejection, especially when that rejection comes from someone you literally created with your own body. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls I didn't return and text messages that got increasingly demanding. Then my sister Patricia called. Patricia, who I'd always been close to, who knew every secret I'd ever kept. She wanted to meet for coffee. We sat in a Starbucks near her place in Scottsdale, the kind of Starbucks where people worked on MacBooks and ordered drinks with 6 modifiers. Patricia stirred her latte for way too long, not meeting my eyes, and I knew. I knew before she even opened her mouth that something was terribly wrong. The coffee shop was crowded that afternoon, filled with the sounds of espresso machines hissing and conversations overlapping. Someone's baby was crying in the corner. A barista called out complicated drink orders. And through it all, my sister sat across from me, her face twisted with guilt and something else I couldn't quite identify. Righteousness, maybe, like she was doing something difficult but necessary. She told me everything. How Michael had approached her months ago, asking questions about my marriage, about my fidelity, about whether there was any truth to the old rumors. How he'd gotten our brother involved, our cousin Elena, even Rachel's parents, building this case against me like I was on trial for a crime I'd never committed. They'd been meeting, discussing me, dissecting my life and my choices, all behind my back. "How many meetings?" I asked. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from someone else's body. Patricia looked uncomfortable. 3, maybe 4. Michael set them up. He made a whole presentation, with a timeline and everything. He's very thorough. A presentation. My son had made a PowerPoint presentation about my alleged infidelity. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating, and Patricia, my own sister, had participated. She'd fed him details about arguments she'd witnessed between me and my late husband, twisting innocent disagreements into evidence of infidelity. She'd helped him build the narrative that I was a liar, a cheater, someone whose word couldn't be trusted. "Tell me exactly what you said," I demanded. "I need to know what you told him." She shifted in her seat, wrapping her hands around her cup like she was cold, despite the Arizona heat outside. "I told him about the time you and David had that huge fight, when you locked yourself in the bedroom for 2 days. Michael was at camp, remember? David was so angry, and you wouldn't talk to anyone." "We'd just lost a baby," I said quietly. I was grieving. We both were, in different ways. Patricia blinked. "You were pregnant?" 16 weeks. Miscarriage. We hadn't told anyone yet because it was early. That fight you mentioned? David wanted to try again immediately. I needed time. We were both devastated and taking it out on each other. I watched her face go pale. What else did you tell him? The camping trip, she whispered. The one where you went alone that weekend. I was at a teaching conference in Flagstaff. David had the flu and didn't want me to catch it before my presentation. He insisted I go. There are photos, Patricia. Programs with my name on them. It was for my career. And the man at church, she continued, her voice getting smaller. The one you had coffee with several times. Stephen Rodriguez. He was a guidance counselor. I was consulting with him about a student who was being abused at home. We met in public, during school hours, to discuss how to help a child. I leaned forward. Did Michael bother to check any of these facts? Or did he just collect your gossip and build his case? Why? I asked her. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from someone else's body. Why would you do this to me? She started crying, real tears that smudged her mascara. Because he asked me to. Because he's your son and he deserves to know the truth. Because you've always been so resigned to everything, like you don't even care what people think. And maybe it's time someone held you accountable. Accountable for what? I asked. For loving my husband? For being faithful? For living my life quietly and bothering no one? What exactly am I guilty of, Patricia? She couldn't answer. She just sat there crying, and I realized that my sister, the person I'd shared a childhood with, who knew me better than almost anyone, had chosen to believe the worst about me rather than defend me. She'd participated in my character assassination because it was easier than standing up to Michael, easier than questioning the narrative he'd constructed. I left my full coffee cup on the table and walked out. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The betrayal was too massive for tears, too overwhelming for any normal emotional response. I drove home in complete silence, no radio, no thoughts even. Just the hum of the engine and the blur of strip malls and housing developments scrolling past my windows. When I got home, I sat in my car in the driveway for almost an hour. I watched Mrs. Chen leave her house with shopping bags. I watched the mailman make his rounds. I watched a couple of neighborhood kids ride by on bikes, their laughter floating through the air like it was from another world entirely. And I thought about how I'd become invisible, how my truth had become optional, how my own family had decided my story wasn't worth believing. Research shows that only 1 in 12 cases of psychological abuse ever gets reported. I thought about that statistic later, much later, when I could finally think again. How many people were suffering in silence, their pain invisible, their stories unheard? I'd become one of them without even realizing it, carrying a burden nobody acknowledged, enduring attacks nobody witnessed. That night, I made a decision. If Michael wanted DNA results, I'd give him DNA results. But on my terms. I contacted a lawyer, a woman named Jennifer, who'd been recommended by a friend from church. I explained the situation, leaving out nothing, and she listened with the kind of focused attention that made me feel, for the first time in months, like my reality mattered. Jennifer's office was small but professional, located in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. The walls were covered with certificates and photos of her with various civic organizations. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that I found immediately comforting. "This is textbook elder abuse," she said after I finished my story. "Emotional manipulation, family conspiracy, financial exploitation." "Did you loan Michael money to start his business?" $15,000, I admitted. "He said he'd pay me back within 2 years. That was 8 years ago." Jennifer made notes. "And you never asked for repayment?" "He's my son. I didn't want to pressure him." "He pressures you constantly about your lifestyle, but you won't pressure him about a legitimate debt." She looked up at me. "Do you see the imbalance here?" Jennifer was blunt. "You've been a victim of family conspiracy and emotional abuse. Your son is trying to manipulate you into proving something you shouldn't have to prove. But if you want to end this, We'll end it in a way that protects you. She helped me gather my important documents: birth certificates, marriage license, old photo albums, letters my husband had written me during his deployment before Michael was born. We built a file that told the real story, not the twisted version my family had constructed. And yes, we arranged for DNA testing, but through a legitimate laboratory, with proper chain of custody, with results that would be legally unassailable. The process was more complicated than I expected. We had to schedule appointments at a certified facility, provide government IDs, have photos taken, get fingerprinted. Everything was documented, witnessed, sealed. Jennifer explained that this level of thoroughness was necessary because if Michael ever tried to dispute the results, we needed an ironclad paper trail. He won't be able to claim contamination or fraud, she explained. These results will be legally defensible in any court. Do you think it'll come to that? I asked. Court? She looked at me with sympathy. I think you should be prepared for any possibility. The waiting period was excruciating. I moved through my days like a ghost, teaching my last few weeks before full retirement, smiling at students who had no idea their teacher was crumbling inside. I stopped answering calls from my family. I stopped attending church, couldn't bear the sympathetic looks from people who'd heard rumors. Mrs. Chen still brought dumplings, but I could see the questions in her eyes, the concern she was too polite to voice. My last day of teaching was in late March. My colleagues threw a small party in the teacher's lounge, with grocery store cake and cheap champagne in plastic cups. They'd made a poster board with photos from my 35 years in education, hundreds of students' faces smiling back at me. Principal Michaels gave a speech about my dedication and impact. Everyone hugged me and wished me well in retirement. I stood there accepting their congratulations, thinking about how none of them knew what I was going through. To them, I was the beloved Mrs. Martinez, finally getting to enjoy her golden years. They didn't know that my golden years were tarnished, that my family had turned against me, that I was spending my retirement funds on lawyers and DNA tests to prove I hadn't committed a crime I'd never been accused of until now. One of my former students, now a teacher herself, pulled me aside. Mrs. Martinez, I just want you to know that you changed my life. I was ready to drop out in 5th grade, but you saw something in me. You believed in me when nobody else did. I held it together until I got to my car. Then I sobbed so hard I couldn't see to drive home for 20 minutes. I started having panic attacks. Real ones. Where my vision tunneled and my heart raced so fast I thought it would explode. I'd be in the grocery store reaching for cereal, and suddenly I couldn't remember why I was there, what I needed, who I even was. The first time it happened, I left my cart in the middle of the aisle and drove home in terror, convinced I was losing my mind. The second panic attack hit at the pharmacy. I was picking up blood pressure medication, standing in line, when suddenly the walls seemed to close in. My chest tightened, my hands went numb, and I couldn't catch my breath. The pharmacist, a young man with kind eyes, noticed immediately. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need to sit down?" I couldn't speak. I just stood there gasping, my vision narrowing to a pinpoint. He guided me to a chair, brought me water, stayed with me until I could breathe again. When I finally recovered enough to speak, I apologized profusely. "Don't apologize," he said gently. "Panic attacks are terrifying. Have you been under a lot of stress?" I almost laughed. Stress didn't begin to cover it. At night, I'd lie awake making lists in my head of everything I'd sacrificed for Michael. My career advancement opportunities, because he needed me at soccer games. The relationship I'd almost pursued with a kind widower from church, because Michael said it was too soon after his father's death. The retirement savings I'd depleted to help him start his business, money I'd never seen again and never asked for. My autonomy had evaporated so gradually I hadn't even noticed it disappearing. Like water evaporating from a glass, you forget you left on the counter. Studies show that 8% of elder abuse citations involve exploitation and neglect by family members. 8%. Over 7,600 cases. And here I was, a statistic I never imagined I'd become. Abused not by strangers, but by the person I'd loved most in the world. I thought about my late husband constantly during those weeks. David had been a good man, a steady man, someone who never questioned my love or loyalty. He died of a heart attack while mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning, dropped dead before the paramedics could arrive. Michael had been devastated, or I thought he had been. Now I wondered if he'd spent the last 7 years quietly resenting me, blaming me for something, building this case in his head until it consumed him. David would have hated this. He would have confronted Michael immediately, would have demanded respect for me, would have protected me from this torture. I missed him with an intensity that physically hurt. Missed his presence and protection and the way he'd always made me feel valued. We'd had our struggles, like any married couple, but he'd never doubted me, never questioned my integrity, never made me prove my loyalty. I found myself looking through old photos late at night, studying pictures of David and Michael together. Michael at 2, sitting on David's shoulders at the zoo, both of them laughing at the elephants. Michael at 10, helping David change the oil in our old sedan, his face smudged with grease. Michael at 18, standing next to David at his high school graduation, David's arm around his shoulders with unmistakable pride. The resemblance was undeniable. They had the same nose, the same way of tilting their heads when they were thinking, the same habit of rubbing their left eyebrow when stressed. How could Michael look at those photos and still doubt? How could he see his father in every mirror and still demand proof? The DNA results came back on a Thursday in early April. Jennifer called me into her office, sat me down in a leather chair that smelled of furniture polish and old books. The results were exactly what I knew they'd be. Michael was my biological son. 99.97% certainty, no room for doubt or speculation. I stared at the paper, at the numbers and charts that reduced 35 years of motherhood to cold data, and I felt nothing, absolutely nothing. "Are you okay?" Jennifer asked, watching my face. "I don't know what I am," I admitted. "Part of me is relieved. Part of me is furious that I had to do this at all. And part of me is just empty." She nodded. "That's normal. You've been through trauma. This result doesn't erase the harm that's been done." Jennifer asked if I wanted her to send the results to Michael directly. I said no. I wanted to deliver them myself. I needed him to see my face, to understand what he'd done, to reckon with the devastation he'd caused. But I couldn't just hand them over. I needed time to prepare, to plan my exit from the toxic ecosystem my family had become. I started small, opening a new bank account Michael didn't know about, transferring money bit by bit so he couldn't track the pattern. I boxed up my most precious belongings, the photo albums and jewelry and letters, storing them at Patricia's house before I realized she couldn't be trusted either. I moved them to Jennifer's office for safekeeping. The process of reclaiming my financial independence was eye-opening. I discovered that Michael was listed on several of my accounts as a joint owner, something I'd agreed to years ago when he'd convinced me it would make things easier if something happened to me. Jennifer helped me remove him, change all my passwords, set up new security protocols. "This is a common tactic," she explained. "They position themselves as helping you, protecting you, making things convenient. But what they're really doing is gaining access and control." I secured copies of all my financial documents, changed the passwords on my accounts, updated my will to remove Michael as executor. Every step felt like peeling off layers of dead skin, painful but necessary. I was preparing to shed the version of myself that had accepted this treatment, that had believed family unity was worth any sacrifice. We also drafted the cease and desist letter that I'd eventually give to Michael. Jennifer insisted on including specific language about harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. "You need to make it clear that there are consequences if this continues," she said. My community at church noticed I'd been absent. Father James came by the house, knocked gently on my door like he was afraid I'd shatter. We sat on my porch, the one with the twice-painted blue trim, and I told him everything. He listened the way priests do, with infinite patience and zero judgment, And when I finished, he said something I'll never forget. "You spent your life teaching children to stand up for themselves. Maybe it's time you became your own student." "But he's my son," I protested. "How do I stand up to my own son?" "The same way you'd stand up to anyone who was hurting you," Father James replied. "With truth, with boundaries, and with the understanding that love doesn't mean accepting abuse." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Finally, Father James spoke again. "I've been a priest for 40 years. I've seen families torn apart by money, by grudges, by misunderstandings. But I've also seen people rebuild their lives after devastating betrayals. You're stronger than you think you are." "I don't feel strong," I admitted. "Strength isn't the absence of fear or pain," he said. "It's moving forward, despite both." That's when I knew I had to confront Michael, had to end this nightmare in a way that preserved whatever dignity I had left. I called him, asked to meet at his house, my voice flat and businesslike. He agreed immediately, probably expecting me to beg for forgiveness, to grovel and plead, and accept whatever conditions he set for our relationship moving forward. The night before the confrontation, I barely slept. I rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd stand, where I'd place the envelope. I imagined his reaction 1,000 different ways. Would he apologize? Would he double down? Would he show any remorse at all? By the time the sun rose, I'd exhausted every possibility except the one that actually happened. Nothing. His reaction would be nothing. I showed up on a Saturday morning, the DNA results in a manila envelope that felt impossibly heavy. Rachel answered the door, her expression a mixture of triumph and discomfort. She led me to the kitchen, where Michael sat at their granite island, expensive coffee in hand, looking every inch the successful executive who'd conquered his unfortunate past. The house was immaculate as always. Fresh flowers on the counter, probably arranged by their housekeeper. The floors were so polished I could see my reflection in them. Family photos lined the hallway. Professional shots that had probably cost hundreds of dollars. I noticed that recent ones barely included me, and when I did appear, I was pushed to the edge of the frame, literally marginalized. I didn't sit. I placed the envelope on the counter between us and said, "Here, this is what you wanted." He opened it slowly, reading through the results with the kind of focus he probably used for business contracts. His face didn't change. No relief, no shame, no emotion at all. Just a slight nod, like I'd confirmed a suspicion rather than proven my innocence of a crime I'd never committed. The silence stretched out. Rachel stood by the refrigerator, her arms crossed, watching like this was dinner theater she'd paid to attend. Somewhere in the house, I could hear a clock ticking. Outside, a lawnmower started up. Normal Saturday sounds in a moment that was anything but normal. "Do you have anything to say to me?" I asked. My voice shook, but I forced myself to continue. "Any apology? Any acknowledgement of what you put me through?" Michael looked up, his eyes cold. "I had a right to know. You can't blame me for wanting certainty." "A right to know?" I repeated. "You had 35 years of certainty. You had a childhood full of love and sacrifice and proof of my devotion. What you wanted wasn't certainty, Michael. What you wanted was an excuse." "An excuse for what?" His voice was sharp now. "An excuse to distance yourself from me. An excuse to erase where you came from. An excuse to pretend you built your success entirely on your own, without the mother who sacrificed everything to give you opportunities I never had." A right to know? I felt something snap inside me, that crack from months ago finally giving way. "I gave you certainty every day of your life. I gave you love and sacrifice and everything I had. And you repaid me by treating me like a criminal." Rachel stepped forward, her hand on Michael's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "You have to understand, this was hard for him too. The rumors, the uncertainty, It affected his reputation. His reputation. I actually laughed, a harsh sound that didn't feel like it came from me. Your reputation matters more than 35 years of motherhood. More than the nights I sat beside your bed when you had pneumonia? More than the college tuition I paid by working 2 jobs? You've never understood the pressure I'm under, Michael said, his voice rising. I work with people whose parents are senators, CEOs, old money families. Do you know what it's like to constantly worry about whether someone's going to bring up embarrassing stories about my background? Embarrassing stories? I felt my hands clench into fists. You mean stories about having a mother who loved you? A mother who worked herself to exhaustion to give you every advantage? A mother who was faithful to your father until the day he died? Those embarrassing stories? Michael stood up, signaling the conversation was over. I appreciate you providing the results. I think we both need some space now. Space. He wanted space, as if we were colleagues after a difficult project, not mother and son bound by blood that was now scientifically verified. I turned to leave, my body moving on autopilot, and then I stopped. I pulled out another envelope, one I'd prepared with Jennifer's help, and placed it next to the DNA results. This is a cease and desist letter. If you or anyone in this conspiracy contacts me again without my explicit permission, I'll pursue legal action for emotional distress and defamation. I'm also removing you as executor of my will and beneficiary of my life insurance. You wanted certainty. Here it is. You're certainly not the son I thought I raised. I walked out before he could respond, before Rachel could protest, before I could see the impact of my words on his face, because honestly, I didn't care anymore. The sirens I mentioned at the start? Those came later, when Rachel called emergency services claiming I'd threatened them. I hadn't. I'd simply stated legal facts. But they wanted drama, wanted to paint me as the unstable one, and what better way than a wellness check called by concerned family members? The police arrived at my house 30 minutes after I got home. I was sitting on my porch, shaking but calm, when the patrol car pulled up. 2 officers approached cautiously, hands near their weapons, clearly expecting a volatile situation. "Ma'am, we received a call about a disturbance," the older officer said. "Are you all right?" I showed them everything: the DNA results, the cease and desist letter, Jennifer's business card, the documentation of the family conspiracy. I explained the situation calmly, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I watched their expressions change from suspicion to understanding to sympathy. "Let me get this straight," the younger officer said. "Your son demanded proof that you're his mother. You provided it, and when you set legal boundaries, they called 911? That's correct." The older officer shook his head. "Ma'am, I'm sorry you're going through this. We'll note in our report that there was no threat, no disturbance, and that this appears to be a misuse of emergency services. You might want to consider filing a report yourself." The police found nothing wrong, of course. I showed them the documentation, explained the situation calmly, and they left with apologetic expressions and advice to consider a restraining order. But by then, I'd already made my decision. I was leaving Phoenix, leaving the life I'd built, leaving everything except my dignity and my truth. Do you think that was fair? That Michael got his proof but faced no real consequences? That my family conspired against me and suffered nothing except my absence? Tell me in the comments, because I still don't know the answer. Some days I think justice means punishment, that people who hurt us should pay in visible, tangible ways. Other days I think justice is internal, that finding peace despite their actions is victory enough. I spent the next 3 months rebuilding, not my relationship with Michael, that was dead and buried, but myself, my finances, my independence, my sense of worth that had been so thoroughly demolished. Jennifer helped me understand my rights, connected me with a financial advisor who taught me about asset protection and estate planning. I learned things I should have known decades ago: how to safeguard myself against exploitation, how to recognize manipulation before it takes root. The financial advisor, a woman named Diane, was patient and thorough. She helped me understand exactly where my money was, where it had been going, and how to protect it moving forward. We discovered that I'd been far more generous with Michael than I'd realized. Beyond the $15,000 for his business, there had been countless smaller loans that were never repaid, bills I'd paid when he was between paychecks, gifts of cash for holidays and birthdays that were never reciprocated. "You've given him close to $40,000 over the past decade," Diane calculated, showing me the spreadsheet she'd built from my bank statements, "and received approximately $2,000 back in gifts and occasional dinners. Does that seem equitable to you?" I took control of my retirement accounts, consolidated my assets, learned to invest wisely for my future. Every dollar I secured for myself felt like a small act of rebellion, a middle finger to the family that had tried to reduce me to nothing. I opened an Etsy shop selling the quilts I'd been making for years, turned a hobby into actual income. Not much, but enough to prove I could still create value, still contribute, still matter. My Etsy shop surprised me. I'd started it on a whim, photographing some of the quilts I'd made over the years and posting them with minimal descriptions. Within a week, I had my first sale. Then another. Then someone commissioned a custom piece for their grandchild. Before I knew it, I was waking up every morning to check my orders, planning new patterns, choosing fabric combinations that made me happy. The quilts gave me purpose when everything else felt meaningless. Each stitch was an act of creation, proof that my hands could still make beautiful things even when my heart felt broken. I'd sit at my sewing machine for hours, the repetitive work, meditative, and for those hours, I could almost forget what Michael had done to me. The community that had supported me through the worst of it became my new family. Mrs. Chen and her husband, Father James and the church group, other retired teachers who understood the peculiar pain of being dismissed by the children we'd devoted ourselves to raising. We formed a support network, met weekly for coffee and conversation, shared our stories without judgment. I learned I wasn't alone. Sarah, a former colleague, had been financially exploited by her daughter for years. Margaret's son had committed her to a nursing home against her will to access her house. Tom's kids had started a competency hearing, trying to declare him mentally unfit so they could control his inheritance. We were all casualties of the same war. Elder abuse disguised as family concern, exploitation wrapped in the language of love. Our Tuesday coffee meetings became sacred. We'd gather at a local diner, crowd into a corner booth, and talk for hours. Sometimes we cried. Sometimes we laughed at the absurdity of our situations. Always, we reminded each other that we weren't crazy, weren't overreacting, weren't responsible for our children's choices. Sarah told us about the time her daughter had forged her signature on a home equity loan. Margaret described being physically removed from her own house by police while her son changed the locks. Tom showed us court documents where his children claimed he was showing signs of dementia, using his occasional forgetfulness as evidence he needed a conservatorship. "My granddaughter testified against me," Tom said, his voice breaking. "Said I'd forgotten her birthday. I hadn't forgotten. She'd changed the date on Facebook as part of their evidence building, but the judge believed her, not me." We were survivors, all of us, learning to rebuild lives we never imagined we'd have to rebuild. Before I finish my story, I want to share something crucial I learned through this nightmare, something that might protect you or someone you love. Prevention for the future isn't about being cynical or suspicious of your family. It's about being smart, about establishing boundaries and safeguards before crisis hits. First, protect your financial assets legally. Create trusts, establish power of attorney with someone you trust absolutely, maybe even a professional rather than family. Update your will regularly and keep it with an attorney, not in your house where relatives can access it. Consider a financial advisor who has a fiduciary duty to act in your interest alone. These aren't acts of paranoia. They're acts of self-preservation. Second, Maintain independence in all forms. Keep your own bank accounts, your own credit cards, your own sources of income if possible. Don't become financially dependent on your children, no matter how much they insist they want to help. Dependence breeds vulnerability, and vulnerability invites exploitation. I'm not saying reject help, but maintain enough independence that you could survive without it. Third, document everything. Keep records of financial transactions, save emails and text messages, maintain a paper trail of your life. If conspiracy or exploitation ever occurs, you'll need evidence to protect yourself. I learned this the hard way. If I hadn't kept old letters and photos, I wouldn't have had the documentation to refute the rumors. Fourth, stay connected to community outside your family. Isolation is the abuser's best friend. When you're alone, cut off from outside perspectives, you become easier to manipulate and control. Maintain friendships. Stay active in community organizations. Keep relationships that provide reality checks and support. These connections saved me when my family became my enemies. Fifth, know your legal rights. Elder abuse is a crime in all 50 states. Financial exploitation, emotional abuse, even the deliberate spreading of malicious rumors can have legal consequences. You're not powerless, though they'll try to convince you that you are. Consult with an attorney who specializes in elder law. Many offer free initial consultations. Sixth, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if someone's behavior toward you shifts in ways that make you uncomfortable, don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it as stress or busy schedules or temporary problems. Trust that discomfort and investigate. I ignored red flags for months because I couldn't imagine my son would deliberately hurt me. By the time I acknowledged the truth, the damage was severe. Finally, understand that you have the right to set boundaries, even with family, especially with family. You have the right to say no, to demand respect, to walk away from toxic relationships regardless of blood ties. The cultural narrative that family is everything, that we must forgive anything, that blood is thicker than water, that narrative enables abuse. Family should mean safety, support, love. When it becomes the opposite, you have every right to protect yourself, even if that means severing ties completely. I wish someone had told me these things decades ago. I wish I'd been prepared, had safeguards in place, had understood the warning signs before I found myself in the middle of a family conspiracy. But I'm telling you now, sharing what I learned through pain, so maybe you won't have to learn it the same way. Now I live in Tucson, about 2 hours south of Phoenix, far enough to feel like a fresh start, but close enough that I didn't have to leave Arizona entirely. I have a small apartment with a balcony where I drink my morning coffee and watch the sunrise over the mountains. I've joined a quilting circle, made new friends who know my story and accept me anyway. I volunteer at a local literacy program, teaching adults to read, finding purpose in helping others without the expectation of anything in return. The move to Tucson was harder than I expected, packing up 30 years of life into boxes, deciding what to keep and what to donate, saying goodbye to Mrs. Chen and the porch I'd painted twice, but it was also liberating. Every item I chose not to bring with me felt like shedding weight I'd been carrying too long. My apartment here is smaller, but it's mine. The balcony faces east, and every morning I watch the sun rise over the Catalina Mountains, painting the sky in colors that still take my breath away. I've planted herbs in containers, created a small garden that I tend with the same care I once gave to raising my son. The herbs don't demand DNA tests. They don't question my love. They just grow, responding to care with growth, the way relationships should work. My grandchildren send me letters sometimes, drawn pictures and short notes that Rachel must approve before mailing. I treasure them, keep them in a special box, but I don't fool myself into thinking I'll see those kids again. Michael made his choice. He chose his reputation over relationship, his pride over his mother, and I've accepted that. Some losses you grieve and move on from, not because the pain disappears, but because you refuse to let it consume you. The last letter came 3 weeks ago, Emma had drawn a picture of a house with stick figures, and she'd labeled one of them Grandma. It was tucked in a corner, smaller than the others, almost an afterthought. But she'd remembered I existed, and that was something. Jake's contribution was a handprint in blue paint, probably a classroom project. I hung both pictures on my refrigerator, then took them down the next day. Looking at them hurt too much. Patricia tried to reach out last month. A long email filled with apologies and explanations. I read it once, then deleted it. Forgiveness isn't something I'm ready for, maybe not something I'll ever be ready for. That's okay too. You don't owe forgiveness to people who hurt you, no matter what greeting cards and inspirational posters say. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to acknowledge the damage and move forward without reconciliation. I sleep better now. The panic attacks have mostly stopped, though I still have moments where grief ambushes me unexpectedly. I'll see a mother and son laughing together in a restaurant, and I'll have to leave, my chest tight with loss. But those moments are becoming less frequent, less devastating. I'm healing, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The question I keep coming back to isn't whether Michael was right to demand proof. It's whether I was wrong to give it to him, to participate in my own humiliation by providing evidence of something that should have been accepted on faith and history. Jennifer tells me I did what I needed to do to end the situation. That compliance was a strategic choice rather than weakness. Some days I believe her. What I've gained through this nightmare is clarity. I know now that I'm stronger than I thought, more capable of surviving abandonment than I ever imagined. I know that my worth isn't determined by whether my son acknowledges it. I know that family is a choice, not just a biological fact. And I'm choosing to build family with people who actually love me, who actually see me, who actually value my presence in their lives. I've also gained perspective on sacrifice. For decades, I believed that giving up my autonomy, my dreams, my financial security for Michael was noble, proof of my love. Now I understand it was a trap, a slow surrender of self that left me vulnerable to exploitation. Real love doesn't require martyrdom. Real family doesn't demand you diminish yourself to make them comfortable. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this long, messy story. Thank you for listening without judgment, for letting me process this pain out loud. If you made it this far, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, what time it is in your world. Let me know if this resonated with you, if you've experienced something similar, if my words helped you feel less alone. If this story connected with you in any way, if it made you think or feel or question, please hit that like button. It helps others find these stories, helps build this community of people who refuse to suffer in silence. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of survival and rebirth and hard-won wisdom, subscribe to this channel. We're building something important here, a space where difficult truths can be spoken and heard. I'd love to know what you think. What would you have done in my place? Would you have provided the DNA results, or refused on principle? Do you think I should have fought harder for a relationship with Michael? Or was walking away the right choice? Your perspective matters. Share it in the comments. Before you go, check out the 2 videos I'm recommending in the description. One is about financial abuse in families and how to protect yourself. The other is about rebuilding after betrayal, finding yourself again when everything familiar has been destroyed. Both might resonate if this story touched you. Until the next story, take care of your heart. Protect your peace. Remember that you deserve respect, dignity, and love, especially from the people who claim to be family. And if they can't give you those things, if they choose to hurt rather than honor you, you have every right to walk away and build something better. Take care.